How to leave the world that worships should. Let faxes butter curl on dusty shelves. Let junk mail build its castles in the hush of other people's halls. Let deadlines burst and flash like glorious fireworks somewhere else. As hours go softly by, let others curse the roads where distant drivers queue like sheep. Let emails fly like panicked tiny birds. Let phones unanswered ring themselves to sleep.
Above, the sky unrolls its telegram, immense and wordless, simply understood. You've made your mark like bird tracks in the sand. Now make the air in your lungs your livelihood. See how each wave arrives at last to heave itself upon the beach and vanish. Breathe.
It's about 3 o'clock on a sunny, dare I say it, spring afternoon, early spring. And I've cycled out to what has started to become my happy place. A little green in the middle of Newnham, which is about a mile away, mile or so from where I live. I'm just sat on the grass, probably getting a damp bum, but looking at the daffodils and crocuses growing around me, and on my right is a pond full of bulrushes that are shedding like dandelions. And a couple of errant ducks chucking themselves around. I've come here because, frankly, I needed to get out of the house. I needed to get away from my own head for a little bit. I've been doom scrolling the news. I've been getting annoyed with work. I've been snapping at my darling wife and daughter when I've been tired. It's tough, man. It's not always easy. And so I've been given a little bit of respite while they're out, just to take the bike, first time this year, and just trundle on up this way. It's got me thinking about different types of pressures that we all have in our life, and how being fully connected at all times is such a curse. And I think sitting right here and feeling the sun on my face, feeling the grass underneath my hands and underneath my back, just for a tiny bit, I feel I can just be. I think if mindfulness is a thing, and it is a thing, and it does work, and it can help, you've got to let go of a lot of stuff in order to simplify and keep it within your mind. I'd become a bit obsessed with download numbers. My William Blake episode was, and still is, the fastest growing episode I've ever done. And I worked hard on it, and I worked hard on getting all the pieces in place and travelling up and all this. But what you guys probably didn't know was that 24 hours before that I had an awful stomach bug, which just came out of nowhere. I found myself thinking, am I going to have to pull the plug on this? So travelling up to London, wandering around, meeting up with John, who was fantastic, but who I'd never met before, and trying to string an episode together and make it sound good, and then editing it down and making it all sound as good as I could. These things all take time, they all take energy, and I don't ever spend any time just not doing something. I've become quite manic as I get older. I get it from my mum, God love her, and it's my natural disposition. What is should? If we break it down, if we look at the title, I suppose it's this idea of obligation. We feel obligated in our lives. Communication is something that you're supposed to take part in and something that you're supposed to do, and I must admit, I'm one of those people. I get annoyed if people don't respond to me. I get frustrated. I think it's rude. And yet, as I've become older and more distracted and busier, I sometimes find myself being one of those people and going, I will reply. I'm just, in a minute I will. I'll do it another time. I just need to do this first. And obviously some of the modes of communication in this poem are now outdated. I don't believe anybody sends faxes these days. But again, that I'm old enough to remember fax machines and how they sort of would burst to life, and out comes this message, very intrusive actually, much more intrusive than a little notification on a phone. And the idea that they butter curl, I always seem to remember they were in this really thin paper with the holes on the side. And they would come through and sort of, wait there. And again, this idea of the communication when it arrives for you, there's something very intimidating and frightening about correspondence. Who here hasn't worried when a letter's dropped through the door with your name on it and it looks official, and it could be a bill, or it could be a fine, or it could be something that you don't want to open. In a way, all correspondence has its weight to it. Even now, everything being electronic, we don't. If we were to rewrite this poem for 2025, would be looking at how a WhatsApp group can be muted, but you still have to read the messages? Would we be looking at, say, how if somebody sends you a video message, what are you supposed to? Are you supposed to be listening to it in a public place? And then, of course, there's the phone call, which it does go on to talk about the idea of the phones unanswered, ringing themselves to sleep. I suppose all ideas of the modern world being attacks on your time are in this poem. We're allocated these days of the week where we are not allowed to not answer the phone, we're not allowed to not answer the email, and we have a bit of a downer on anybody that's seen to be shirking that. Obviously, if I was doing this for the Philip Larkin Society, it would be looking at toads and toad work and the idea of it squatting on your life. This is a bit less invasive. It's more of a surmisal of why do these things matter? Deadlines bursting and flash like glorious fireworks somewhere else. And in a way, I guess that's the whole point of this artificial world that we create, the world of work, the world of deadlines, the world of time. It's a human construct. And it doesn't actually tell us how to leave the world that Worships should. I don't think that it's an instruction manual. But as I sit here and I read the line above, "The sky unrolls its telegram," I found myself just looking up into the blue, and it's a cloudless sky above me. And I just forgot how hopeful it makes me feel and how much more relaxed it makes me feel. We're not meant to be sat at a desk forever. We're not meant to be sitting in front of laptops. Humans need to get out and do things. Yes, including sitting on a village green with a recorder in one hand and a poem in the other, and the people in the beer garden across the way looking at you like you're completely mental. Yes, humans need to do this kind of stuff too. And obviously we have this lovely rhyme scheme here. Shelves, hush, burst, else, curse, sheep, bird, sleep. It's, I believe, a sonnet, or certainly in sonnet form. But the sense of it being, it's very much broken in between. We've got this really clear break of the octave and the sestet, that's the 8 and the 6 lines. And, oh, there's a duck. Yeah, sorry, a very large duck just flew right over my head. I'm not sure why. He's, yeah. Ironically, I was just about to talk about the emails flying like panicked tiny birds. But if you've ever been off work, if you've ever had to take some time off work, if you've ever left a job, or suddenly you realise how completely meaningless so many of these things really feel. They don't have meaning anymore. They cease to be relevant. They cease to be relevant because people don't need you to answer them, and it's the idea of how much power we give something. We give emails power over us, we give deadlines power over us, but all deadlines are pushable. All emails can be deleted. And then we have the immense and wordless to describe the sky. Simply understood. And there is something very primal about when the sun comes out again. There's something that I think in the psyche where we see sun, and I know that the Brits have a reputation for seeing the first ray of sunshine and whipping their tops off and drinking cans of Stella on the park green. I assure you, I'm not drinking right now. And my clothes are resolutely on, for now. But that idea of the sun awakens something in the earth, and it awakens something in us. And even if it isn't a sunny day, the sky overhead, it's always just there. It's this kind of reassuring reminder that with all the other stuff going on, there is something out there for us. Like this person who's been reversing up and down their gravel drive for the past 10 minutes. I'm trying to do a podcast here, you plebs. And I'm not sure if it's supposed to be a holy image or an image of God, but the idea that it's understood by all humans. And then the final part here about the air in your lungs. Make the air in your lungs your livelihood. And again, the things that you do, I was feeling really quite glum, quite low, but I got on the bike and I've tootled around a bit and I suddenly feel a bit more human. Same as when I go for a jog, getting out the door's hard, but if I get out there, I fill my lungs with air and suddenly things feel a bit more doable. See how each wave arrives at last to heave itself upon the beach and vanish. Breathe. I've always loved that last line because of the reminder of, as these waves crash upon the beach, they vanish, but they don't, they disappear, they come back. They go back into the water and it's perpetual. And actually, just like you're breathing, you must keep going. You must keep taking in big lungfuls of air. I know when I'm anxious and I know when I'm having a bad day because I feel like breathing is a chore, if that doesn't sound too stupid. I find myself taking shallow breaths and sitting here for the best part of 20 minutes now in the sun. I've been able to take some nice big deep breaths through the nose, out the mouth, and just centre myself again. Ironically, given what the poem is about, I will also have to have my phone with me for when I am being told that the girls are arriving back. But just now, just right now, it's just you and me. And I appreciate that.
because it is actually a very allocated poem. Because
Mm.
to these places, or do you just pretend to go? Just get the soundtrack.
No, no, I'm always there.
Are you? Wow.
Well, when it says always, I mean the whole point, I suppose, of the podcast is trying to find a place that really fits the poem. And
Mm,
sometimes I can surprise myself by going, "Oh, I hadn't thought of that." But this poem, I've actually recorded the initial reflection part of it a couple of Sundays ago. I took my bike out and I'd had a very stressful work week, and I'd sort of sat in the middle of this park, and there was no one else around. And I was listening to the birds, and just sat there with my little portable recorder. But I had the poem printed out, and I read it, and then talked about some of the images within it, but also just tried to really reflect on, blimey, this poem really feels very, very relevant right now to the concept of like
mm.
looking up to the sky and trying to sort of really emphasize to myself, you need to get away from these distractions, even more so, I think, in 2025 than possibly when the poem was first written, which could be one of the things we're
Yeah, I
talking about.
think so. Yeah, I think life hasn't got any less pressured, has
Mm,
it? And we're also much more than when the poem was written, sort of slaves to the little
mm,
block in our pockets that keeps
mm,
us sort of
mm,
very tethered to the world. And even if we're doing something like scrolling Instagram, there's a sense that it's constantly telling us we're not doing enough. That's
mm,
my feeling. It's like, oh, look at all these people being really successful or having these really great lives, and I really need to be doing more. So that wasn't so present when I wrote this poem way
mm.
back when. It was actually written in 2004, which is a lifetime ago, isn't it?
Not to make you feel in any way older, but
Oh God, don't.
I believe I was one of the years that studied it as I left school, because I left school in 2004. So it's possible I would have studied it then, but I actually think
Wow.
I think I first encountered it when I first started teaching. It's a little bit blurry for me as to when, because
Mm.
mid 2000s. I remember reading it when I did my first teaching placement quite a few years later, and I remember thinking, oh, what a cracking little poem. And it was often used for the unseen poetry. I think it was used in one exam paper one year for sure.
It was actually very bizarrely. I first knew about this when I got a sudden hit or a huge surge of interest on my website,
Mm,
and I had no idea why. And then I discovered that it had been set as the unseen poem, both for GCSE and A level
okay.
at the same time. And the people who set, I met one of those people years later who had actually chosen the poem, and they had no idea that it had been set by another board for the other exam.
Ah,
It just suddenly came into the zeitgeist. I don't know. So
that's popularity for you. The exam
mm,
boards are fighting over it. Do you remember what year that was? Which exam year it might have been?
not entirely sure.
No.
No. It's a funny poem because, well, not that funny, but strange, an odd poem amongst all my other poems in that it came really quickly, like a download. And the reason why, I think, is because I hadn't been able to write for some time because of having my daughter. My experience of pregnancy is when I'm pregnant, I can't write at all. That apparently I'm entirely creating baby and my brain won't create anything else. It says you've just got to focus on the baby. And then immediately after she was born, because when she was born, my ex-husband stopped my maintenance payments for my three boys. And my husband became ill, chronically ill, 3 months after our daughter was born. And suddenly there was no income, and I had to, scrabble about. And I felt very pressured, even though I wasn't going to a job. And I know this is quite popular with people who work in cubicles. And it was actually issued it was an Arts Council commission, actually. It was a series of sonnets
Mm.
commissioned by the Arts Council. And they made them into postcards. And this is the postcard that people had in their cubicles, you know. And it was printed up with a sort of blue sky background. So it was this aspirational, I'll get out of here and breathe.
It's a superb poem, and I've always enjoyed it. I've always enjoyed teaching it, especially when I'm trying to teach the sonnet form. because I like being able to say, okay, so this one does obviously break quite obviously between the octave and the sestet, but the form still works. The meter still makes what you're reading feel very, well, in the case of this poem, it makes it feel urgent, but also weirdly laconic as well towards the end. That's what I've really enjoyed. I feel like that break really does capture that the poetic speaker trying to say, come on now, I know this stuff is important, but you need to take time for yourself.
Well, as I said, it kind of came like a download, so it almost felt like I was sort of receiving the words.
Mm,
I wasn't generating them, and it came very naturally, which is unusual, but always
mm,
lovely when it happens. But I think it was because I had this huge there was a lot of creative energy sort of dammed up because I hadn't been able to write anything that was worthwhile for about 18 months by the time I came around to this poem, or maybe, no, maybe a year, maybe it wasn't, maybe not quite as long as 18 months. But the whole time I was pregnant, I couldn't write. And then immediately after that, I was just trying to get an income. And it was really hard because I also had a small baby and my husband was sick and we had a lodger in the house who was, you know, I don't know, taking up a lot of my husband's time, and
mm,
then they would be laughing and joking, and I was hanging up washable nappies and things and thinking, I want to be writing. It
mm,
was sort of infuriating. And then I got this Arts Council commission to, which of course is hugely valuable to me, some paid work, doing what I actually love and am good at. And also I was able to hand my daughter over and say, I have to go and do this writing job. And in the very first day of the commission, it was based around Herne Bay, essentially. They said, go
mm.
to Herne Bay. It was a residency where I wasn't actually resident, but I could drive there, spend the day there, and drive back. And as I was driving to Herne Bay, I was listening to Radio 4, and they were reading from the book In Praise of Slow. And I think that was a very important thing that fed into this poem,
Mm.
that awareness. And I was listening to this In Praise of Slow. And then I arrived and it was very quiet. I think it was a Monday morning in Herne Bay. Not many people around. It was off season. It was like April. And I parked up, went down onto the seafront. And I read this thing about the air. They had a sort of information board that in Victorian times people would visit Herne Bay to take the air. The air was thought to be particularly healthy. It had come straight across from the continent,
Mm.
and I think that's probably why this poem ends with the word breathe. And that's why also that see how each wave arrives at last to heave itself upon the beach and vanish. Breathe. It was that sense of, you're rushing through your life. I felt all this pressure of I should be doing this and I should be doing that. I was giving myself migraines, sort of being torn in all these different directions. And then suddenly I had this space of this day that was just mine. And I didn't have to think about anything. I was just there to sort of land a poem, and it felt like the poem just sort of landed me.
Mm.
The first lines just began to arrive while I was just standing there breathing on the seafront. And I then sat in a cafe and just wrote it all down, and it was almost word for word as it is now. And that's also quite rare because often I will spend a lot of time tinkering with things.
Did the last couple of lines almost appear first for you, given that you were by the seaside and the waves, obviously? Did that sort of? I've sometimes found with my own writing process, if I have one, occasionally I get the last line first, or I end up with a last line which won't go away, and then the rest of the poem sort of starts to stack itself up from there. Or was that
That
not the case?
that has happened before, and it has happened particularly with sonnets. There's something about the couplet that you're
Mm,
sort of drawn towards the couplet. And I've definitely had sonnets where the couplet came first, but that wasn't the case here. And in fact, that first stanza, it really did sort of unroll line by line. And there was something about Auden in it. It was
mm.
stop all
Stop all
the
the clocks.
clocks.
Yeah.
It was the let. It was
Mm,
allow life to go on without you. Allow stuff to pile up. It makes me laugh. It was actually still right at the edge of the age of faxes, and now I understand that has to be footnoted. This is the technology is so
Well,
dated.
I did actually talk about this when I was
Yeah.
recording, sat in my sort of relatively happy place.
Mm.
But I did, I'm 37. I'm of the age where I remember fax machines. I know that they existed. I remember hearing them every now and again. I once did work experience in a place where this fax machine kept going off.
Yeah.
And it's an incredibly intrusive method of communication when you think about it. It's quite aggressive.
Mm.
Suddenly, this piece of paper starts vomiting out of a machine, demanding that you pay attention to it. And it doesn't just do it silently; it does it with this, So in a way, I think it's actually, we think that the smartphone's bad. At least you can turn the bloody thing off. So
Yes, it's funny, isn't it? It is very intrusive. It kind of spewing its paper into your space.
and
There's no ignoring
the
it.
butter curl, I think
Yeah.
that's such an inspired image because the idea of like a very, very thin layer of butter being sort of scooped off the top, almost again, this is how I've read it. Of course, feel free to jump in and tell me I'm talking rubbish, but I always like the idea of if you're trying to do something in a rush, you often do it wrong. If the butter's just come out of the
Mm.
fridge, it's too cold, and if you're trying to scrape it off, it comes off in chunks and it's all very dissatisfying. Whereas if it's just right, it comes off nice and smoothly. So almost by leaving these things they might be a bit more palatable. I don't know. That was how I took
Oh,
it.
I like that. I love that. People often find things, depths that you don't,
Yes,
as the writer, you're not aware. And then afterwards you go, oh, that's great. I said, how
of
clever that
course.
I did that.
Of course, I meant to do that. Yeah,
It's totally subconscious. I
yeah.
mean, it's just associations, isn't it? That
Mm.
the image arrives and you don't necessarily know why. And then other people can dig into that and come up with reasons. And I've quite enjoyed this and the poem that's a set poem material on the A level Excel syllabus
Mm.
that I've quite enjoyed occasionally looking at people's interpretations of the poems. And sometimes I think no, way off base. And then every now and then I go, that's that. What it's lovely to hear people's insights into
Mm.
something that was really just a very unconscious process. And I think, yes, there's definitely something in that because this is very much about leaving things,
Mm.
leaving things and allowing things, just it's not that urgent. You can just let that go and let the mail build up and, you know.
If we were to sort of look at it in its historical context, if that doesn't make it sound like a backhanded compliment about how long ago it was, how how much of it do you feel take away the fax machine reference
Mm,
necessarily, but how much do we think that the urgency of life has maybe gotten worse on one hand, but
mm.
actually on the other hand, there is now we at least pay more lip service to the concept of mindfulness and mental health. I don't know. I'm always intrigued to know are these things existing in a counterbalance? It's very easy to go, God, it's all awful now, isn't it? But actually, I'll be becoming a bit better at saying, no, I'm not going to do that, or I am going to turn this off at this time. What do you think?
Yeah, I do. I think I think the sheer pressure has built up to an unsustainable
Mm,
kind of level, and many people recognize that. Um, my daughter's Gen Z,
mm,
her generation, interestingly, turning away from. She leaves her phone in her house when she comes to visit me. She
mm,
doesn't. She doesn't bring it with her quite often, um, and she's got into writing letters by hand. She and her friends write handwritten letters. Take the time to do that. Read physical books.
mm.
I mean, maybe they're unusual, but I know that amongst her friends, there's this very strong move away from sort of domination of the screen. They're aware that it doesn't do good things for their mental health. I would say her generation in particular are sort of in a bit of a mental health crisis, really, through
Mm,
growing up with smartphones. And those that are able to are doing what they can to do something about that. And I'm very active on Substack, and I notice there's a very strong sort of slow living movement
Mm.
growing there, about getting closer to nature, getting into gardening, even if it's only a sort of herbs in your window box,
Mm.
trying to slow things down and put yourself on a media diet, cut out the news, do things for your mental health that decrease the intensity of
Mm.
living in the age that we do, which has for some people just become almost unbearable. And I think you just have to go, this is bad for me. This is as bad for me as smoking.
Mm.
You actually really have to take action, like giving up smoking, give up the news. I actually have a phone safe because I'm quite addictive in my smartphone relationship. Um, so I have a safe where I lock it away for hours. You set a timer and you can't break in. So yeah, it's a bit like treating it like a serious drug addiction or
Mm.
something. Yeah.
And it's funny, really, because I think 2004, we've got what at the time felt like widespread mobile rollouts, and almost everybody that you knew suddenly seemed to have a mobile phone,
Yeah.
that you could be contacted at any time. And yet, I think it's one thing that I the let phones unanswered ring themselves to sleep, because I always think of I'm a huge Philip Larkin fan, and
Yes.
the
Me
poem
too.
or bard. I
Yeah, my
think of
favorite
the
poem. That's my favorite Larkin poem.
Yeah, meanwhile, telephones
Yes.
crouch, getting ready to ring in lots of
Yes.
offices. And
Mm.
I've always found, uh, in a way, we talk about the new generation, we think of a phone being sort of on us at most times. But the concept of actually the phone, there being one in the
Mm.
house, and actually, in a strange way, nowadays, if someone phoned me at 3 a.m., I wouldn't notice because my phone is either off, or if it's not off, it's on silent and I wouldn't notice. But the phone ringing in the dead of night is something that I don't think that many people understand the dread of what that would feel like. I remember as a teenager or so, our phone once rang at silly o'clock,
Mm.
and it was when my granddad had suddenly passed. It's
Mm.
never good news.
No.
And almost that idea of something ringing away, but being okay to leave it. That's what I took from that line.
Yeah, there was something in that for me, and I think because I also had just had a baby, that thing of let them cry themselves to
Yeah.
sleep was, was in my mind. But absolutely, Larkin is in there because that's my favorite poem, and I know most of it by heart just
Mm.
because I've read it so many times, and it was actually very close to me around this time. I would say about sort of 5 years before I wrote this poem. That's when I learned "Or Bard by heart because
Mm.
I was really struggling with things, and I found that poem extremely helpful, weirdly, in its bleakness. You know how it is when I was also listening to a lot of Radiohead, when you're really down and you need someone who's really down with you to feel less alone. And that's what I found in that Larkin
Sometimes,
poem.
yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes Larkin just puts an arm around you, offers you a cigarette, and
Oh,
says, "Hey, cheer up."
absolutely.
And then he goes, "Only joking." It's really bad.
But it does end up with that postman like doctors go from
Mm.
house to house. And there's just something, it's like there will be a dawn. There is,
Mm.
and the intricate rented world begins to rouse. Those beautiful lines at the end of that
Mm.
poem that makes me just give me shivers just saying them again. I
And
love
yeah,
that poem so
in
much.
a way, you have the sky unrolls its telegram. This
Mm,
this idea of correspondence, things, and one thing I would always pick out is how there are little references here to different modes of communication. And we've got
mm,
emails flying like panicked tiny birds, the telegram, the phones, the letters, the
mm,
faxes, the junk mail. Sorry, which I think is
mm.
wonderful as well. All mail feels like junk mail these days.
It does,
Um,
yeah, because you don't
no,
get personal letters
no,
anymore, do
no,
you?
exactly. Well, and in a way, that concept of the postman like doctors wandering around,
Mm,
it's how much is this good for us? Are these people delivering us good things, or are the reason why they're like doctors because we're all sick of too much communication? And again, I could talk about Larkin for hours on end, but
yeah.
I'm feeling somewhat stupid that I didn't spot some of the homages, if you like, little subconscious homages to
Mm,
Bard here.
mm. It's funny you should say that about that Larkin poem, though, because In fact, I read a terrific piece about Larkin's relationship with his mother, his very close
Mm,
relationship with his mother, and their letters, and it looked at that line in terms of, he was a depressive his whole life,
mm,
and he clearly leaned on his mother emotionally very much and really looked forward to his letters. So I think in that case, it's more like administering to your
mm,
sickness, because so much. I remember looking forward to the post when I was younger because I used to get personal letters, and I remember being excited and going, "Will a letter from my friend or my boyfriend or my mum arrive today?" And
mm,
I think Larkin, for him, that was a very hopeful thing. The doctor
mm,
ministering to your sickness, saying they might deliver a letter from your mum. So
mm.
we read it differently now because it is all junk mail.
It is, and yet, funnily enough, if you've ever struck up a letter correspondence, and it's funny to think of the younger generation now doing so, it is intensely, like you say, rewarding.
Mm,
Not so long ago, I got quite fortunate actually. I ended up striking up a letter correspondence, so, somewhat unwittingly. I didn't mean to, but with a former student of mine, just started that way, and it was one of those things where it was easier for them to write to me at my school because I didn't want to give
mm,
away where I lived. And so it just meant that I'd get these letters about how they were doing at uni and, now they're off traveling. And because it was a letter and I didn't have any kind of contact details with them besides that, it was personal. I saw their handwriting and it felt like I dedicated time to it in a way in which an
mm.
email or a WhatsApp, it's just not the same. It just all feels like mush that just disappears into the same thing. Like you say, building their castles.
Mm.
Um,
Yes, a
in
physical
yeah.
physical thing. I agree that this. I mean, I started with it, didn't I? Faxes and junk mail.
Mm,
I think it was that sense of the pressure to respond that
mm,
was very strong. That I felt like there were a lot of demands, and especially when you want to write. I mean, my email inbox is still one of those things that I have to have it as a management task, and
mm,
I lose sleep at night thinking, oh no, haven't responded to that email. And the more we've gone into sort of, the more, because obviously this was the age of emails were happening and they seem to demand a much quicker answer than
mm,
letters. That people kind of expect you, and texts even more so, people expect a response. And that pressure to respond, you end up being very reactive, and it's much
mm,
harder to be creative when you're just constantly responding to people's messages. And of course, if you respond quickly, it can just become a conversation, and you get to the end of the day and you've just had a lot of conversations, but you haven't written a poem.
mm,
So I think that the pressure of communication was very strong, but I noticed that throughout, I'm linking them to more natural things. I mean, faxes and butter and the junk mail. Castles, I suppose, man-made, and I'm not obviously not very hot on the junk mail. But I suppose castles are more, they're kind of splendid. It's like it's made art in your hall. So,
it had a slight hint of The Trees for me by Larkin, the unresting castles thresh. You know,
oh wow,
it had a
I read that poem at my grandmother's funeral.
mm,
So
it's
trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said. Yes.
I think in a way though, this is where every time you write anything, you are a part of all you've met. To
Mm,
quote Tennyson, you always find there's something that's lodged itself in you from a poem that you loved elsewhere, and that I think should be celebrated. Every poet that's ever
mm,
been has been drawing on someone else's work in
yes.
some way.
Yeah.
The natural imagery actually, I liked linking to what you're saying. The
Mm.
panicked
Yeah.
and
Panic tiny birds. Yes.
this, but in a way, you're right. Email correspondence can feel very flighty, very sort of very light until it's not. Until you've had an email at work which suddenly sets your teeth on edge, and you think, oh,
Mm.
hang on a minute. And like you say, you become quite reactive. And I found myself hammering out a furious response to a colleague or a manager, and then having to hover over the send button and then talk myself down from saying something really quite awful that will come back to haunt me.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas a letter, it's self-censoring, really. I'd have to write it, and then I'd probably go, oh, I'm not going to send that, obviously, but I'll keep it to remind me of how I felt. So it is
because it's a
interesting.
because it's a slower process. more thought must go into it. You can't be as reactive. By the time you get to the, however long, unless it's a really short letter, by the time you get to the end, you've calmed down a bit. You've processed your emotions a little bit by writing them out. Yeah,
Mm.
very, very different thing. And I think possibly this is why we live in a more fractious, combative kind of world where people are more easy, they react badly, they're more likely to misinterpret and jump at each other because we have these much faster means of communication that don't allow us time to think things through.
Do you feel like there's if we were reading this poem with sort of any positive aspect of it from the correspondence, do we think that there's anything good that's come of it in terms of the fact that we're now more in contact with each other and therefore can be there for one another in a way in which we might not have been? I think of people who'd fallen off the face of the earth now. It's much harder to do that. So reclusive people, I mean, maybe they're not happy about it, but I'm thinking of, people who want to check in on them, check they're okay. Or is that in a way still a bad thing that people can't hide?
Well, I mean, I guess if you want to hide, you leave your phone at home and go wandering, or
True. Mm.
or terminate your contract. But I generally think it's a good thing. I mean, obviously, there's good and bad in everything, right? So social
Mm.
media is both good and bad.
Mm.
The modern communication methods are both good and bad. I personally love email. It's my preferred method because I love to write. So I'm not mad about phone calls. I've really
Mm.
gone right off phone calls
Mm.
because I don't want to have to think on my feet or make decisions, just like
Mm.
that. I'm always a bit concerned someone might say something that I'm not ready to react to. And an email, I can at least think about it a little bit.
Mm.
I think Zoom is great. Here we are talking
Mm.
to each other on Zoom. Would I make the time to travel to see you or you travel to see me in order to have this conversation? Possibly not. Depends how
It's-
important it is to you. I'll tell you what,
it-
I wouldn't. I wouldn't be going, yeah, I'll get on a train. I'm going to go and see Joe. Just because I'm trying to protect my writing time,
Of
you
course.
know. And so Zoom is great. I can connect
Mm.
with all kinds of people all over the world
Mm.
and have conversations I wouldn't otherwise have. So I love that. And I think it's very good for people who, for example, there's still people who are shielding from
Mm.
COVID or any other, nasty disease that might happen to be going around. People with severe disabilities who can't
Yeah.
leave the house. I've been running a poetry group for years for the poetry school. I'm just about to finish after about 11 years,
Mm.
deliver my last session, decided it's time. But we ran it through COVID online and it had always been an in-person group. And one of the people who joined was someone who's severely disabled, would never be able to come when it was in London. And we
Mm.
had someone else from Germany who would never be able to come when it was in London, And I thought, well,
Mm.
it was actually very sad for them when it went back to being in person because they were missing out on it made it obviously much more accessible, even though I really love the energy of being in person and it's very different teaching online. It's actually hard, it's much harder.
Mm.
But so I think there are many good things about it. And I will say, again, I'm sorry to say Substack for the third time since we've started speaking. You can just edit it out, Joe. But it's that's a fantastic community of people building there. It's very different from the other social spaces that I've experienced over the last 20 something years. There are, I would say, people are much more nuanced. They're much more, they're thoughtful in their communication. I've had disagreements that have then we've talked it out and then there are agreements
Mm.
rather than just attacking each other. It feels like there's a lot of what you talk about mindfulness and sort of people who are much more sort of consciously aware of their impact on other people through their communication, who are communicating honestly, authentically, vulnerably,
Mm.
also supportively, writing long form stuff. There's a lot of long form readers there. I was told that they were extinct and everyone wants 30-second videos or 10-second or
Mm.
whatever the latest thing is. And there's people there reading 2,500 word essays, no problem, every day of the week. So it's not all bad.
Mm.
That the new technology has made that possible. And I think we're fantastic human beings. We're absolutely fantastic. It doesn't always look like it when you look at politics or
Mm,
you know climate problems, the rape of the planet. However, we are amazing problem solving, intelligent, and imaginative beings,
mm.
and fundamentally good-hearted. There's always bad actors, and quite often they seem to grab power and you know take the tiller when you wouldn't
I,
want them to.
I think it's the towards the end of the poem, one of the things that I've always really liked about it, and I think still really links with what you've just said, is that we go from these images of the civilization, but the trappings of it, the distant drivers queuing, and
Mm,
obviously the phones and the emails, and then we have this the Volta, if you like, the break between
mm,
them. This suddenly the sky unrolls its telegram. I've always, if I read this, I try and emphasize its because I feel like it's like the
mm,
sky is saying, "Hang on a minute, guys, I've got something for you here." Immense and wordless, simply understood. You've
mm,
made your mark like bird tracks in the sand. That the imagery just becomes far more natural. And I guess to link exactly with what you said, we are amazing things, humans, but we are part of nature, and nature lives in us. And if we don't engage with nature, it's incredibly, it can become a very bleak existence if we spend
mm,
too much time with each other, not looking without so much as we keep looking within and sort of navel gazing with our own lives. I think that's absolutely what's at the heart of this poem, is that
mm.
it's a need to connect, but not just with each other, with the world.
With the world, with nature,
Mm,
with being part, as you say, with being part of nature.
mm,
And also, I think there was that very strong awareness for me of the sea has that
mm,
eternal quality. The sea has that, wave after wave after wave, and it's been
mm,
going for how long, millennia.
mm,
But also, imagine each one of us is a wave and it has its time and then it sinks into the sand and it's like your life's only so long, and do you really want to spend it answering emails, you know?
mm. No,
It's
absolutely. And the feeling I get always after reading this poem, and I don't keep it in front of my cubicle, as it were, but it's one of my it's a poem that I keep handy in case of emergencies, if you like.
I like that. I like that.
I feel it's really good. Naturally, I have used it every now and again just before exams when
Mm,
students are getting very, very jittery, especially top sets, which I often tend to teach. And I think
mm,
it's a really good poem to say, okay, we are going to study this, but we're also going to actually think about what it's asking us to do here. Because actually, if you are not relaxed enough in this exam, if you don't remember to breathe, you are going to screw this up probably because you're not going to be thinking straight.
mm,
And it's the irony of,
mm.
someone could get marked for reading the poem wrong. But in a way, that's why it works, because it's a poem with humanity at its heart, I think.
Mm. I was contacted when it was an exam, the unseen poem, in two exams in the same year, in the same month, same week, I think, even that those
Mm,
exams were held. I had several teachers get in touch with me and say how incredibly helpful it had been in the exam when the
mm,
people are there under pressure and they turn and they read the poem and it actually has an effect of relaxing them, and that it had
mm,
been a really great poem to meet in stressful circumstances. So that
definitely.
makes it an interesting exam choice. Yeah.
No, it's like I said, it's a superb poem, and I'm actually really thrilled that I've got the opportunity to talk to you about it, because it's very difficult with some of the other poets in my podcast series to actually just give them a ring and chat to them on account of them
I
all
know.
being dead.
Dead. I noticed that.
Yes, but also for me as well, it's good. The whole point of the podcast, I wanted to try and take poetry out into the real world and sort of bring it back for people. And not only is it lovely to talk to the poet themselves, but also to, if with this poem, it's especially fitting to communicate about what it might mean, but also what it's supposed to make us feel, rather than it
Mm,
being I'm sure there are some living poets who wouldn't be as thrilled about little old me asking them silly questions. So thank you. I really appreciate that.
It's a pleasure, Joe. I'm always human first, you know? That's my approach.
And in terms of if anybody who's listening to this who doesn't necessarily know your work, I know that you do a lot of other stuff. Where can they find everything Ros Barber?
Rosbarber.com. Kind
There
of
we go.
predictable, isn't it? Yeah, ROSBARBER.com.
And that will
Yeah.
have links to your Substack as well.
Yes, it has links to my Substack where I am, putting out a lot of free writing every Friday at the moment. I might have to cut it down to every other Friday because I really need to get dug into the next novel. But yes.
Fantastic. And in terms of your novels, what is in the pipeline, or are you sworn to secrecy?
I have a huge book that I spent almost 10 years writing and researching while I was also teaching and working full time. So it took a long time, partly because I was doing it around earning a living, but also because it's sort of massive in a good way. I mean, the whole world, and I can't I can't give you news on that yet, but
Okay.
I'm hopeful that it won't be too far in the future where it will find the right home and come out. And I'm working on the next one. So that will be my third. Um, and I'm in the middle of writing my fourth. And of course I've written loads of unpublished ones. So it's just in terms of I think it must be about my I'm working on my eighth now, but
Okay.
that's how
And
it
it
goes.
and I don't often get the chance to ask this because I'm not always interviewing a guest, but if there were any poems that you'd like to hear covered by the Sketch Poetry podcast, and if you've
Mm.
got any thoughts on where they could be, have you got any thoughts on that front?
Have you done All Bard? Have you?
I haven't, and I'm terrified of doing it because, well, for two reasons. One, it's one of the big ones that
Mm.
I think is, it's incredible, and I wouldn't want to do anything that slightly ruined it for anyone listening who was a true fan. The other thing is the setting for it for me has to be waking up to Soundless Dark. And I do slightly worry that if I woke up at sort of 5 a.m. As the first light is creeping through and the sky is white as clay, and I started sitting there in bed recording, I would be divorced very shortly. So there is
Mm.
that.
Yes, you're right. The setting's not right. You need something with a strong setting. Okay.
Maybe I
Mm.
could find a suitably bleak spot to talk about it. I mean, I had all sorts of inappropriate places I could read Larkin poems, like reading The Old Fools in a nursing home, or um, you know, this be the verse in a nursery, things like that.
Yes.
But in a way, I
Mm.
think Larkin's sort of very potent misery with things means that
Mm.
you've almost got to be. I find he's a bit like like a radioactive thing. You've got you just can't spend too long there in that setting reading it because it could potentially not be great for me. But I would love to do a bard. It's on my list. I'm just figuring out how I can get a right setting for it.
I mean, I'm going to sort of completely just go Larkin, Larkin, and nothing else. But Wits and Weddings on a train.
Already done.
Oh, I haven't seen that
It's
one.
okay.
Damn.
No problem. Yes, I did already do that one.
Okay.
But actually the one that I
Too
am
obvious.
the one that I am potentially going to do, which is very on the nose, but I think it has to be done, is I'm going to go to Chichester Cathedral at some point fairly soon and do an Arundel tomb.
Right.
Because I've
Yeah.
never been and seen the Earl and Countess, and
Mm.
I'd like to be able to go because it's if nothing else, it's one of the places I've always wanted to visit and actually see that with my own eyes and the little dogs under their feet and everything. I know it will be very on the nose, but I think it
Mm.
will also provide a nice audio sort of soundscape. Are there any non-Larkin
Yes.
ones? You go on.
You've given me time to. So, what about, I mean, going up to Yorkshire, going up to Lumbank and doing something Ted Hughes?
Ooh, now we're talking.
Ooh, yeah,
Mm.
because I mean, there's a lot of outdoor stuff that you could do there. I mean, the one that was I mean, kind of very important poem for me when I was a teenager was The Thought Fox. And
Mm.
I'd been given a book of Larkin poems by my English teacher. And I was meeting him in lunch hours on Wednesdays, sharing my poems with him.
Wow.
And he was giving me feedback on my poems. And then he wrote to Ted Hughes, and I ended up meeting Ted Hughes in
Oh,
person because of my
wow.
English teacher. He basically found out that Ted Hughes was doing a reading in a school nearby. But I say nearby, it was about 40 miles away. And we just bunked off school together. I was like 14, 15. And he drove me over to Billericay, and I met Ted Hughes in person. I saw him read, and I met
Wow.
him, and it was incredible. Um, and my English teacher had given me this collection of Ted Hughes poems, and Thought Fox was one of my favourites. And I mean, it's very much a writer's poem,
Yeah.
isn't it? And um, I loved it, and I kind of knew it very, very well. And then when I was doing my English O level, as it was then, before it was GCSE, I turned over, and that was the unseen poem, was
Oh,
Thought
wow.
Fox. And it felt like such a gift. It was like, I could not believe. It's like, oh, yeah, no, this is no problem. I know this one like the back of my
Feel
hand.
like
So.
writing, and I know this because Ted told me this is what he meant.
Yeah, so I'd love it. I mean, there's a lot to choose from, but I'm
Mm.
sure you could find something very geographically centered there.
Yeah, I thought
I
about
mean,
doing maybe
that one's like
hawk.
scratching pen in a room, isn't it? So
Yeah,
it's
I thought about possibly hawk roosting and
mm,
going because not too far from me is a big hawk conservancy, and that could potentially be an idea. I mean, I actually live in an area where we are surrounded by red kites all the time, which is
right.
quite
Wow.
impressive. So maybe that, although I don't want to get too close to them because they're bloody massive and quite scary. But I will have a think, and yeah,
Mm,
if you ever get the if you ever get the urge when this episode comes out, if you wanted to share it with people, I'd obviously
mm,
appreciate it because then it would be nice to have other people. Because what I've been trying to do is get a bit of a snowball of people saying, "Can you do
mm.
this poem? Can you do that poem?" And I've had bugger all actually. So
All right.
I've just been doing what I want to do, which is nice, but
But you'd like some input now. Yeah.
it would help me. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'll do what I can to drum up some suggestions for you. As I say, very engaged audience over in my new home in
Mm.
Substack, and they do talk to me. I can ask them things, and they'll probably respond. So,
One last thing, if you wouldn't mind.
depends.
It'd be great if you could read the poem in its entirety
Yeah.
now.
All right. I'll do that.
Thank you.
How to leave the world that worships should. Let faxes buttercurl on dusty shelves. Let junk mail build its castles in the hush of other people's halls. Let deadlines burst and flash like glorious fireworks somewhere else. As hours go softly by, let others curse the roads where distant drivers queue like sheep. Let emails fly like panicked tiny birds. Let phones, unanswered, ring themselves to sleep. Above, the sky unrolls its telegram, immense and wordless, simply understood. You've made your mark like bird tracks in the sand. Now make the air in your lungs your livelihood. See how each wave arrives at last to heave itself upon the beach and vanish. Breathe.